the way we live, precisely because they feel pain, they can be hurt, and we're constantly hurting these creatures.
Let's talk about the difference between various societies. How do we explain differences in culture, the treatment of women, the treatment of different races, genders, sexualities in various societies, if there is a single God with a single morality, or if there is a social contract standard?
Yeah, now here I don't think there would be any significant difference between us, in the sense that this is a question about moral epistemology, that is to say how we come to a knowledge of the good and the right, rather than a question of moral ontology, which is a question about the objective reality of the good and the right. And I think we would both agree that the objective existence of moral values and duties doesn't imply that these are always easy to grasp, or that people infallibly do grasp them, given our human proclivity to selfishness and
sinfulness. So certain
sinfulness.
societies haven't caught up?
Yeah, I have absolutely no qualms about being politically incorrect and saying that certain societies, like National Socialist Germany, were morally corrupt. Or Afrikaner South Africa, or...
what about Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, in its treatment of women, I think it's appalling. I think that once you have a transcendent moral standard that transcends culture and society, you're in a position to make the kind of judgments that the court did at Nuremberg in saying that these Nazi leaders were war criminals and were justly condemned for what they did. If you lack that transcendent standard, then I think you are faced with the problem of sociocultural relativism.
Well, as Craig says, this is, I think, actually a point at which we are in large agreement. I might not use the word transcendent here, but I think I agree otherwise with virtually everything he said. So, if the question is, what's the explanation of the fact that so many societies have had morally appalling moral codes, the answer, in part, is it takes a while for civilization to work its way up to recognize moral truth, just as it takes a while for civilization to work its way up to recognize truths in any other domain. So I believe in evolution. I believe for familiar, I was making a remark like this over dinner, that for familiar evolutionary reasons, we were built to think the world moved along roughly Aristotelian lines with regard to physics. It's bad physics, but it's understandable why evolution would select us to think that something like Aristotelian physics was so. Happily, evolution also implanted in us reasoning capacity to step back from the beliefs that it gave us at the ground level and to challenge them and to test them. And so we've worked our way up from Aristotelian physics, and similarly, it takes centuries to work our way up to the point at which we recognize that all people are equal. It takes centuries until we work our way up to the point at which we recognize that women count as much as men, blacks count as much as whites, and that animals count too.
Very nice. We'd like you to give some closing statements, just a few words.
Wow.
To the students.
Okay. Who's going to go first?
Who goes first?
Who went first?
I went first.
Why don't you go first this time?
Okay. I didn't prepare a closing statement, so this is just, I'm going to just wing it. I've argued tonight that if God exists, then you do have an objective basis for moral values, moral duties, and moral accountability. And I don't think that that's ever been disputed tonight. The debate has been more about whether naturalism can give you these things. But we haven't really contested that if God exists, then you will have a sound foundation for morality. God's own holy and just nature will be the good and will define the good as all things relate to it. His commandments to love him and to love our neighbor as ourselves will furnish grounds for our moral duties and obligations that will be objective and transcultural. And then our lives will have a paramount significance because the moral choices we make really do make a difference. They have eternal consequences. So I think theism is tremendously attractive and would invite you to consider it for yourselves. By contrast, on naturalism, it's hard to see why these creatures we call Homo sapiens have intrinsic moral value. This moral contract seems to me to be just a fiction and not really anything more than a social convention that Homo sapiens conspire among themselves to fancy themselves valuable. And this is especially evident, I think, on materialism and determinism, where, as I say, making a moral decision is no different than a tree growing a branch. It's hard to see how a puppet and its movements can have moral significance. In terms of moral duties, again, without someone to prohibit something or to command something, it's very hard to see how things can be prohibited or commanded. That's very different than the law of contradiction, I think, because the law of contradiction doesn't prescribe behavior. It doesn't say to you, don't contradict yourself. You're free to do that if you want to. It just says if you do so, you're irrational. But the moral duties are giving you prescriptions for behavior, for ways you ought to behave. And it seems to me on atheism that they're just like rules of etiquette. And then finally, moral accountability. I've already talked about that it's hard to see why we should always adopt the moral point of view rather than just act in our own self-interest on atheism, since it really doesn't make any difference in the long run. So I would just invite you as students to think deeply about whether or not theism isn't the better foundation for building your own moral life and a career that lies ahead of you.